Bateman's is a 17th century stone manor house in Sussex, about 15 miles from the south coast. Rudyard Kipling came here aged 36 when he was already a famous writer. He felt from the start that he belonged here, and at the last, when his varied life was drawing near its end, he sat down in his study at Bateman's to write his autobiography, which he called Something of Myself for My Friends Known and Unknown.
Looking back from this, my 70th year, it seems to me that every card in my working life has been dealt to me in such a manner that I had but to play it as it came. Therefore, ascribing all good fortune to Allah, the dispenser of events, I take up my pen. It was the heartbreaking locomobile that brought us to the house called Bateman's.
That's her. The only she. Make an honest woman of her, quick.
That's what we're looking for. That must be our very own house.
Mrs. Kipling? Oh, very prompt.
Oh, yes, indeed. Shall we go in? My husband will follow us shortly.
Would you like to follow me in?
We entered and felt her spirit to be good.
There are 5 main bedrooms, Mrs. Kipling.
And I want to see them all.
Well, the master bedroom is just on the left up here. Mr. Kipling?
It faces north, of course.
But it is rather splendid. We went through every room and found no shadow of ancient regrets or stifled miseries. Listen to the quiet.
Yes, we can find peace here.
Thank you for showing us the house, sir.
Not at all. Pleasure.
You'll be hearing from our lawyers directly.
And now that you've really decided, I can ask you something. How are you going to manage getting to and from the station? Nearly 4 miles, and I've used up 2 pairs of horses on the hill here.
I was thinking of using one of these contraptions.
Oh, I don't think these things have come to stay.
Years afterwards, I met him, and he confided that had he known what I had guessed, he would have asked twice the money.
Rudyard Kipling is one of the most quoted English authors, second only to Shakespeare. When he came to Bateman's in 1902, he was on the crest of a wave. His books and poems were read everywhere, and when he'd been seriously ill some 2 years earlier, it had been headline news round the world. But he hated the publicity. He was a very reticent man who tried always to keep his private life totally private. At the end of his life, he wrote the autobiography that he called Something of Myself, but even here he revealed very little of himself. His story really lies in his books. Like many writers, he made life the raw material of his art. He was born in India and worked in India. He lived in the United States, and so in that pre-jet age, he was one of the most travelled men in the world. But Bateman's in Sussex became for Kipling his refuge from the outside world, the place where, just before he died, he was to write that very reserved autobiography, looking back to his childhood and to his parents. They met in 1863 at a summer picnic beside Lake Rudyard in Staffordshire. That's the explanation of the extraordinary name they later gave their famous son. Alice MacDonald came of a cultured artistic family. John Lockwood Kipling was an artist and teacher. Immediately after their wedding, Lockwood Kipling took his young wife to India, where he had a new post as an art master in Bombay. Rudyard Kipling was born in Bombay on December the 30th, 1865, The Times of India recorded the happy event. His parents adored their little boy, and he was convinced he was the centre of their world. Indian servants looked after him and spoilt him, and the colours, sounds and smells of Bombay shaped his childhood memories.
My first impression is of daybreak, light and colour and golden and purple fruits at the level of my shoulder. This would be the memory of early morning walks to the Bombay fruit market with my ayah, and later my sister in her perambulator, and of our return with our purchases piled high on the boughs of it. Our evening walks were by the sea, in the shadow of the palm trees. When the wind blew, the great nuts would tumble, and we fled, my ayah, my sister in her perambulator, to the safety of the open. I have always felt the menacing darkness of tropical eventides, as I have loved the voices of night winds through palm or banana leaves, and the song of the tree frog.
चंदा मामा दूर के वे पकाए पूर के आप खाएं थाली में मुन्ने को दे प्याली में आप खाएं थाली में मुन्ने को दे प्याली में प्याली गई टूट.
In the afternoon heat, before we took our sleep, my ayah, or Meeta, my Hindu bearer, would tell us stories in Indian nursery songs, all unforgotten. And we were sent into the dining room after we had been dressed, with the caution, speak English now to Papa and Mama. So one spoke English, haltingly translated out of the vernacular idiom that one thought and dreamed in.
This blissful life was doomed to come to an end. There was a shadow over all English parents and children in India: separation. It was thought no English child could survive the climate and diseases of India. So, when Rudyard was 6, he was sent back home to an England he scarcely knew, not to relations, but to people who fostered children for British officials overseas. He was taken to a small, semi-detached house in Southsea near Portsmouth.
There was a small, new house, smelling of aridity and emptiness. A dark land, a darker room full of cold. Then came a parting in the dawn with father and mother, who said that I must learn quickly to read and write, that they might send me letters and books.
For the rest of his life, he detested every memory of the House of Desolation, as he called it in his autobiography. The little boy was treated as an outcast, neglected and tormented, and no notice was taken of his worsening eyesight, so that he became half-blind.
I lived in that house for close on 6 years. Then, I do not remember that I had any warning, Mother returned from India. She told me afterwards that when she first came up to my room to kiss me goodnight, I flung up my arms to guard off the cuff I had come to expect.
The next chapter of his life was to produce a book. He was sent to school to the United Services College in Devon. He was happy there and made lifelong friends. Nearly 20 years later, he idealized all their schoolboy adventures in a book called Storky & Co. When he was 16, his life changed abruptly again, once more without his being consulted.
There came a day when the head told me that a fortnight after the close of the summer holidays of '82, I would go to India to work on a paper in Lahore, where my parents lived, and would get 100 silver rupees a month. So, at 16 and 9 months, but looking 4 or 5 years older, I found myself at Bombay, where I was born.
Kipling was delighted to find that in spite of the long separation, He really liked his parents, and with his sister Trix, the four of them made a happy life together and called themselves the family square. But Kipling deeply regretted leaving England. At school, he'd made up his mind he would become a writer, and he hated the thought of turning his back on London, the heart of the literary scene. But in fact, the return to India was the making of him. The half-remembered dreams of his childhood became sharp and clear, and working as a journalist, he came to know and to report on all aspects of life in British India in a way that no other Britisher ever did. Kipling worked as a journalist in India for 7 years, a stretch he likened to 7 years' hard labour.
I never worked less than 10 hours and seldom more than 15 per diem. And as our paper came out in the evening, did not see the midday sun except on Sundays. I had fever too, regular and persistent, to which I added for a while chronic dysentery. Yet I discovered that a man can work with a temperature of 104, even though the next day he has to ask the office who wrote the article. Who'll shake his hand? I, said the fever, and I'm no deceiver. I'll shake his hand. Who brings him the wine? I, said quinine. It's a habit of mine. I'll come with the wine.
As a journalist, Kipling went everywhere and met everyone. In Kipling's day, the British in India were at the height of their power. Queen Victoria had been proclaimed Empress of India 7 years earlier. Kipling went to Simla, where the Viceroy and his court ruled the vast empire from a mountain village during the hot season. He met the army officers who served in India, and officials who made the system work. He met their wives, lively and frivolous, or bored and unhappy, and saw the wretched life led by the enduring British soldier. During the long, sweating, sleepless nights, he roamed the forbidden districts of the native cities, courting the insomnia that was to haunt him all his life. So no wonder when his paper asked for fillers, short stories or verses to go along with the news items, Kipling had his material all to hand. The stories were collected together as paperbacks for sale on railway bookstalls throughout India. It was the railway alone that could span the vast Indian subcontinent, and the name of Rudyard Kipling was carried everywhere. By the time he was 23, Kipling was the most famous writer in India, but the hard 7-year stretch had begun to take its toll on his mental and physical health. He'd become sickened by India's heat and disease, and he longed to escape. He made a great decision. He packed up and left India, and apart from a brief visit 2 years later, he never went back. Yet his experience had already made him Britain's greatest writer on Indian themes. He went to London to find fame and fortune, and he found his reputation had already got there. Many of his verses had been turned into popular songs and drawing-room ballads.
On the road to Mandalay, where the flying fishes play, and the dawn comes up like thunder out of China, across the bay.
Slangy, catchy, exotic and down-to-earth at the same time, they earned Kipling his enormous popularity with the man in the street. Now the raw young writer from India was the brilliant Rudyard Kipling with the world at his feet, and he mixed with the other literary figures of his day. One of them, Wolcott Balestier, an American publisher in London, collaborated with him to write a novel called Naulika. When Wolcott's sister, Caroline Starr Balestier, came to Europe on a visit, she met Kipling's parents home on leave. Kipling's mother declared on sight, "That woman's going to marry our Ruddy." They were married in January 1892, shortly after Carrie's brother had tragically died. For the first 5 years of their marriage, they lived in Carrie's hometown in Vermont, New England, a cold contrast to the scenes of Kipling's Indian childhood. Two of Kipling's children were born in Vermont, Josephine, whom he loved more than anyone else in the world, and later a second daughter, Elsie. In 1897, they returned to England and lived in Rottingdean, where their son John was born. Since his unhappy years in a house of desolation, Kipling had a great sympathy with children. His delight in his own family prompted him to write some of the world's best children's books, especially the Just So stories which he illustrated himself, and which were based on tales he told his children over and over again. Kipling was devoted to all three of them, and he was a kind and loving father. But Josephine was always closest to his heart.
Best beloved. Now, in the high and far-off times, the elephant had no trunk. He had only a blackish, bulgy nose, as big as a boot, that he could wriggle about from side to side, but he couldn't pick up things with it. Now, there was one elephant, a new elephant, an elephant's child, who was full of satiable curiosity. And that means he asked ever so many questions. And he lived in Africa, and he filled all Africa with his satiable curiosity. Aunt, the hippopotamus, why her eyes were red. When they came back, nobody spanked anybody anymore. And since that day, oh best beloved, all the elephants you will ever see, as well as all those that you won't, will have trunks precisely like the trunk of the satiable elephant's child. Oh!
Daddy's going for a hide and seek!
Oh dear!
Run before he gets you! Run!
Josephine? Josephine, where are you?
Find me, find me.
In February 1899, they had business in America, so they sailed for New York. The crossing had been terrible, and when they arrived, they were all ill, with influenza and the children with whooping cough. Kipling's illness developed into pneumonia. Carrie looked after him in a hotel, whilst outside reporters from the world's press waited for news.
Rudd is rather ill. I trust the papers will not exaggerate it. His simple life and decent habits, they say, will count in his favor, but his lifelong tendency to fever makes him rather a difficult patient. I have arranged to give the papers a daily bulletin, which is all I know.
He began to get better. Headlines proclaimed the good news. On March the 3rd, he was said to be out of danger. But there was a disturbing item alongside his recovery, which Kipling was still too weak to be told. Josephine had developed pneumonia as well, and she had no strength to resist it. She was desperately ill. Because a hotel was no place for a sick child, friends looked after Josephine and nursed her devotedly, but she grew weaker. Carrie went to see her as often as she dared leave her husband.
Sunday, March the 5th. I saw Josephine 3 times today, morning, afternoon, and at 10 p.m. for the last time. She was conscious for a moment, and sent her love to Daddy and all. Monday, March the 6th. Josephine left us at 6:30 this morning.
Carrie left her husband's bedside just long enough to go to her daughter's funeral. When she got back, she realized that Kipling might be disturbed if he saw her wearing black. No one knows when she told him. Something of Myself tells us nothing at all about this dark time of their lives. They tried to keep their grief secret from the world. They went back to England with their other children, but their memories were waiting for them there, as Kipling's father, Lockwood, understood.
Rudd and Carrie, I may confide to you who love them, found going back to the Elms much harder and more painful than they had imagined. The house and garden are full of the lost child, and poor Rudd told his mother how he saw her when a door opened, when a space was vacant at table, coming out of every green dark corner of the garden, radiant and heartbreaking.
They decided to look for a new family home, free from memories. And at last, they found Bateman's. But Kipling found that the ghost of Josephine had got there first. Later on, he wrote a story called They, about a man who discovered the house beautiful filled with the spirits of dead children, and one of them is the writer's own lost child.
The little brushing kiss fell in the center of my palm as a gift on which the fingers were once expected to close, as the all-faithful, half-reproachful signal of a waiting child not used to neglect even when grown-ups were busiest, a fragment of the mute code devised very long ago.
Mr. Kipling!
Wait, sorry. Then I knew, and it was as though I had known from the first day when I had looked across the lawn at the high window.
Josephine's carefree spirit did not make Bateman's an unhappy place for Kipling. She seemed to welcome him, and the house made him happy.
England is a wonderful land. It is the most marvelous of all foreign countries that I've been in. It is made up of trees and green fields and mud and the gentry. And at last, I'm one of the gentry. I'll take up a new pen and explain. Behold us, lawful owners of a grey stone lichened house. AD 1634 is over the door, beamed, panelled with old oak staircase, and all untouched and unfaked. It is a good and peaceable place, standing in terraced lawns nigh to a walled garden of old red brick, and two fat-headed oast houses with red brick stomachs and an aged silver-grey dovecot on top. There is what they call a river at the bottom of the lawn.
Kipling flung himself into all the activities of Bateman's, and whilst Carrie and Hobden, their gardener, planned new paths and hedges, he designed the garden pond, which was a delight to the whole family. Some distinguished guests had the initials FIP after their names in the visitors' book for Fell in Pond. As with everything in his life, the experience shaped Kipling's writing.
That's it, John. Take your first mark there. Bang it in hard, Elsie. Now take a turn round it. Good.
Our England is a garden that is full of stately views of borders, beds and shrubberies, and lawns and avenues, with statues on the terraces and peacocks strutting by. But the glory of the garden lies in more than meets the eye. Our England is a garden, and such gardens are not made by singing, "Oh, how beautiful," and sitting in the shade, while better men than we go out and start their working lives at grubbing weeds from gravel paths with broken dinner knives. And when your back stops aching and your hands begin to harden, you will find yourself a partner in the glory of the garden.
With the help of William Wilcox, the great engineer who had dammed the River Nile, the Kiplings installed their own electricity.
How are you doing, cart horses?
Electricity in 1902 was a serious affair. Wilcox said, "Don't run your light cable on poles, bury it." So, we got deep-sea cable which had failed under test at 1200 volts, our voltage being 110, and laid him in a trench from the mill to the house, a full furlong, where he worked for a quarter of a century.
Years later, Elsie recalled those happy times.
An average day at Bateman's was always a busy one. Breakfast was at 8 a.m., summer and winter, and the large morning post was dealt with immediately afterwards. Anything from 60 to 100 letters came into the house daily.
Aren't you going to have an egg?
The whole family developed an uncanny sense for knowing more or less what a letter might contain by its envelope, and R.K. would seize anything he thought promised to be interesting to open himself. R.K. usually worked in the morning, if he had anything in hand, either doing the actual writing or pacing up and down his study, humming to himself. A walk or more work was followed by lunch, the second post was dealt with, and there would probably be visitors to tea.
Ah, Mr. Kipling, how kind of you to see me.
My dear chap, sooner or later, all sorts of men cast up at our house.
Okay.
Sit up straight, Elsie. There you go.
Farm walks were often taken, and while C.K. discussed with the foreman ditches to be cleaned out, barns to be repaired, or crops to be sown, my father stood by listening, and only sometimes made a suggestion.
Kipling loved to think of himself as a landowner, owning part of England's history. He wanted to pass this feeling on to John and Elsie, and so, in a mock medieval charter, he bestowed on them the freedom of their own River Dudwell, under the shadow of Pook's Hill.
Excepting always such knightly love and fealty as already subsists between us. That the said John Kipling and Elsie his sister shall be at all times free to come and go, whether shod or barefoot.
He wrote stories around Bateman's. One was Puck of Pook's Hill, about Puck, older than the hills, who brings back by magic the people who had lived in that spot hundreds of years earlier. Puck of Pook's Hill was written for John and Elsie, like the Just So stories had been for Josephine.
What angel wakes me from my flowery bed?
One summer evening, John and Elsie acted a cut-down version of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, which Kipling had adapted specially for them.
Man doth mock and doesn't answer nay.
Out of this wood do not desire to go. Thou shalt remain here, whether thou wilt or no. I am a spirit of no common rate. The summer still doth tend upon my state. I do love thee.
Very good.
As a writer, Kipling was a thorough professional, and that was how his cousin, the painter Philip Burne-Jones, portrayed him.
Phil's portrait of me is a regular stunner, and shows especially well in the reproduction. I resent the sleek baldness of my head, but the intellectual air and the tummy are beyond dispute. Like most men who ply one trade in one place for any while, I always kept certain gadgets on my work table, which was 10 feet long from north to south and badly congested. One was a long, lacquer, canoe-shaped pen tray full of brushes and dead fountains. A paperweight, said to have been Warren Hastings, and a tiny weighted fur seal sat on some of the papers. An inky foot rule and a father of pen wipers, which a much-loved housemaid of ours presented yearly, made up the main guard of little fetishes. In Villiers Street, I got me an outsized pewter inkpot, on which I would gouge the names of the tales and books I wrote out of it. Mercifully, the mere act of writing was, and always has been, a physical pleasure to me. This made it easier to throw away anything that did not turn out well, and to practice, as it were, scales. This leads me to the higher editing. In an auspicious hour, read your final draft and consider faithfully every paragraph, sentence, and word, blacking out where requisite. Let it lie by to drain as long as possible. At the end of that time, reread, and you should find that it will bear a second shortening. Finally, read it aloud and at leisure. Maybe a shade of brushwork will then indicate or impose itself. If not, praise Allah and let it go.
In his books, he still lived all over the world. He finished Kim, his masterpiece, 12 years after he left India forever, yet it has been called the finest story ever written in English about India. Lockwood Kipling made some splendid photographic illustrations for the book, which reveal the myriad peoples of India and the search for truth and justice by an ancient lama and a young British boy. The Jungle Books are about India too. Mowgli, the man-cub, is brought up in the jungle by wise talking beasts and becomes king of the jungle when he's learnt the law that teaches every young animal its position and duties.
Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. And the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back. For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack.
Pack, pack, pack!
The Jungle Books became the inspiration for a worldwide youth movement. When Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scouts, was begged to start a society for younger boys, he turned to the Jungle Books with Kipling's enthusiastic permission.
We'll do our best!
Rapturously, small boys identified with Mowgli and learnt the law from Arkela, the wise grey wolf, and from Bagheera, the black panther. They pledged their patriotism and service, qualities in which Kipling himself believed implicitly.
I promise to do my best, to do my duty to God and to the King, to keep the law of the wolf cub pack, and to do a good turn to somebody every day.
Quick, march, left, right, left, right.
If you can walk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but not too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son.
The boys who enrolled in the first wolf cub packs were just old enough to be caught up in the end of the 1418 war. John Kipling, at 17, rushed to join up. He became a junior officer in the Irish Guards, and within a year he was sent to France. 6 weeks later he fought in the Battle of Loos. There were 20,000 casualties in that one battle. John Kipling was reported wounded and missing. He was 18 years, 6 weeks old.
It was a short life. I'm sorry that all the year's work ended in that one afternoon. But lots of people are in our position. And it is something to have bred a man. The wife is standing it wonderfully, though she, of course, clings to the bare hope of his being a prisoner. I've seen what shells can do, and I don't. Have you heard news of my boy Jack? Not this tide. When do you think that he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Has anyone else had word of him? Not this tide. For what is sunk will hardly swim. Not with this wind blowing and this tide. Oh dear, what comfort can I find? None this tide, nor any tide, except he did not shame his kind. Not even with that wind blowing and that tide. Then hold your head up all the more, this tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore, and gave to that wind blowing and that tide.
After the war, Kipling and Carey went together to Loos Cemetery to see the battlefield where John had fallen. Kipling was asked to serve on the Imperial War Graves Commission, and he accepted his sad task as a solemn duty. He was filled with deep bitterness, not at the sacrifice of young lives, but at the way the sacrifice was utterly wasted in the post-war years.
They shall not return to us, the resolute, the young, the eager and wholehearted whom we gave, but the men who left them thriftily to die in their own dung. Shall they come with years and honor to the grave? Shall we threaten and be angry for an hour? When this storm is ended, shall we find how softly but how swiftly they have sidled back to power by the favor and contrivance of their kind?
Kipling's work with the War Graves Commission brought him into contact with King George V, and a great respect and liking grew up between them. Perhaps both of them felt a little out of place in the brave new world of the 1920s, which was turning away from all the old values and ideals. In the heyday of the British Empire, Kipling was hailed as the writer of the hour. He'd believed in an empire based on loyalty and service, but now that empire was dwindling, and Kipling was accused of being out of touch with the modern world. In fact, Kipling had always refused to be officially honoured by the government because he felt he needed the freedom to criticise governments and policies. Although he and Carey were popular figures in society, Kipling felt more and more that his influence was diminishing, that the world was rushing beyond him. Elsie got married and moved away, and though there was still a constant stream of visitors to Bateman's, Kipling's failing health and increasing loneliness became more obvious. One of his friends, the writer Hugh Walpole, wrote of him,
"He really, I think, has no vanity. He's a zealous propagandist who, having discovered that the things for which he must propagand are now out of fashion, guards them jealously and lovingly in his heart, but won't trail them about in public. He walks about the garden, his eyebrows all that are really visible of him. His body is nothing, but his eyes terrific, lambent, kindly, gentle, and exceedingly proud. Good to us all, and we are all shadows to him."
The future held no comfort. Before he died, Kipling saw the rise of Hitler in Germany, and he realized that with the growth of Nazism, the war in which John had died was not over. The Hitler Youth movement was a very far cry from his own wolf cubs.
This is the midnight. Let no star delude us, dawn is very far. This is the tempest long foretold, slow to make head, but sure to hold. Stand by. The lull twixt blast and blast signals the storm is near, not past. And worse than present jeopardy may our forlorn tomorrow be.
Only 3 weeks after he finished writing his autobiography, Rudyard Kipling died on a bleak January day in 1936. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, not far from the tomb of the unknown warrior, which to him had always symbolized his own son's grave. The abbey was being prepared for the funeral of King George V, who had died a few days after him, and with the death of the two honourable and dedicated old men, an era had come to an end. Carey lived on for 4 more years. She devoted those years to preserving Bateman's as a memorial to her husband, and in her will, she left the house to the National Trust. Most of Kipling's ideals of loyalty, devotion to duty, patriotism, and of the empire where all races of men serve together are considered old-fashioned today. Worse still, many of them have become a joke. Even the wolf cubs have forsaken the jungle books and call themselves today simply Cub Scouts. But his books do remain, and readers can make up their own minds about him. And that is exactly what he wanted.
If I have given you delight by aught that I have done, let me lie quiet in the night, which shall be yours anon. And for the little span, the dead are born in mind, seek not to question other than the books I leave behind.
Additional biographical information for this program was obtained from Charles Carrington's biography of Rudyard Kipling.